Welcome to Choice Boards through a UDL lens. There are a lot of connections between blended learning practices and the thoughts and practices and principles behind the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. Today, we're focusing in on choice boards. Choice boards are an amazing way to organize learning options and opportunities for your students. As the name suggests, students get a choice of the types of activities they're going to be completing or the ways in which they're consuming information. Choice boards can be used throughout the entirety of the learning process. For example, they can be used while students are learning, giving choice an option of the types of materials that students are encountering or interacting with as they consume information. Choice boards can also be used at the end of a learning process where students are given the voice and choice of how they're demonstrating their understanding. As with all of these options, the idea behind choice absolutely 100% aligns with the principles and the foundational beliefs of the UDL guidelines. It's about empowering students to have voice and choice. It's about honoring all learners. It's about having multiple means for students to be able to consume information, demonstrate information. So these are perfectly in line. When I go to the UDL guidelines themselves, I once again see all sorts of connections between the principles guiding choice boards and the fundamental beliefs behind them and those UDL guidelines. So I'm going to start in that engagement column with that really inviting students into the learning process. And so if you think about in the first component of recruiting interest, thinking about optimizing individual choice and autonomy. I mean, choice boards are all about choice, but they're also about building that capacity for students to make those choices that honor who they are as learners and build that ability for them to own the learning process and be in the driver's seat. I also think about the optimizing relevance. When students get to choose what's most meaningful for them, in terms of consuming information or being able to demonstrate information, it empowers them and it makes the learning process a little bit more authentic and meaningful. I also think about this minimizing threats and distractions because, once again, thinking about the idea of choice boards, there are certain learning opportunities or experiences that may be barriers for students. And so by empowering them to make choices for what works best for them as learners and having those options, they're able to make choices that allow them to be successful. And so that threat piece of I'm only given one option that is not going to work for me, and it kind of raises the anxiety level. By giving choice boards, you actually decrease that anxiety and increase the opportunity for success. So kind of thinking about that kind of piece too, kind of going down to this self-regulation piece, really thinking about that idea of optimizing motivation. When students can find success and when they feel honored and when they feel part of and empowered to be learners and part of that learning process, I mean, that's super, super motivating to keep them moving forward. So there's lots of connections in the engagement column. When I think about then the perception column, the representation column, really it's about really thinking about offering the multiple means to engage with content. And so I think about that perception piece, and I think about this entire component of offering different ways, offering alternatives to visual information, so text. If you've got a kiddo who maybe has a reading deficit that they're aware of, providing that alternative to support and scaffold them so that they have access to the concepts can really, really, really be powerful. So this idea of offering alternatives in order to help them make meaning. Okay, and then finally, I know there's a lot of connections here, and so I'm not hitting on all of them, but the other one I really want to point out is in this action and expression column. This is really how students are allowed to show and demonstrate what they know. And so once again, we think about this expression and communication component of having multiple means for communication, multiple media, multiple tools for constructing and composing and being able to share information. And then we go down to this executive functioning piece where really allowing students and empowering them to facilitate all of these ideas of really being able to have successful pathways for them to manage and to own the learning and really make that learning their own. So I think about when it comes to choice boards, having them be very aware of their goals and be able to make choices that are going to align with their goals and your goals. And then planning a strategy for how they're going to navigate their way through those choice boards. So when I think about the connections between choice boards and the UDL guidelines, they're all over the place. All right, so with all of that in mind, how would I go about creating a choice board with that UDL mindset, with that in mind, all of these connections? Well, I've hit on a lot of the kind of considerations or the think abouts already, but just to reiterate, first and foremost, with your choice board, know your goals. Know your goals first and foremost. It's so important to ensure that with a choice board, no matter where it's being used in the learning process, that you are very, very intentional about what it is that you want your students to have as an outcome. So I would really encourage you to think about the purpose or the intent of how this choice board is going to be used. I mean, there's a multitude of ways to organize a choice board. You could organize it around, a concept, that standard that you're attempting to have students meet, and a particular concept that you really want them to engage with. Is it going to be instead more of an outcomes-based choice board where you are giving them options of how to demonstrate and represent their learning? So with all of that in mind, kind of think about when you're going to be using it during the learning process and what standards you're attempting to address, and thinking intentionally about having choices that are equal in terms of the outcomes, not necessarily equal in terms of the inputs, but really thinking about what is your ultimate goal, because really it's important to ensure that with the choice board, we know where we want our students to arrive or what we want them to get from it so that they all end up at that same place. I also really, really, really would encourage everybody to think about that multiple modalities. Once again, the UDL guidelines are all about multiple means. So the power of choice boards is really giving kids the choice, that voice in allowing them options. But within those options, really being intentional about options that are valuable and relevant to the students and honor who they are as learners and what they might either need or prefer. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say, for example, a choice board was being used during the learning process, and I was perhaps giving students a choice of 3 different articles to read. Yes, they have choice, but within that choice, all of the options are the same modality. For a student who maybe has that reading struggle, it might be difficult for that student to interact with the concepts and the content because of the actual format of the information. So being mindful and intentional of that, perhaps considering, okay, what other options do I have? Is there a podcast that the students could listen to, or is there a video? So thinking about those multiple means, those multiple modalities of how students can access or interact with the content. Same thing on that tail end. If I'm using a choice board for the outcomes piece, giving students options of how they're going to demonstrate their knowledge, I would want to be really intentional and thoughtful about the different types of things that I'm asking students to do. For example, if I ask students to, they could write an essay, they could write a newspaper article, they could write a speech, they could create a poster. Those are all very text-based options. Yes, there's choice, but once again, if my standard that I'm trying to address, once again, having that goal in mind, if the standard that I'm trying to address isn't necessarily about a writing standard, for example. Is there room to be able to give different options with those different modalities? So then my final thought or recommendation, if I was creating a choice board through that UDL lens, would really be intentional about thinking about the scaffolds that I might need to put in place for students to be successful. Oftentimes when I have worked with teachers in the past and thinking about sharing choice boards, one of the things that I hear oftentimes is that students kind of tend to gravitate towards what they've always done. There's comfort in that, right? But also thinking about, why are students making that choice? Perhaps some of those choices need some additional scaffolding in terms of what's really being asked of them. So thinking about, when you're designing your choice board, what contextualization or extra information are students going to need in order to be successful using that information, or choosing that option? But also thinking about, how can you give students experiences with these different things that you're offering as choice, so that it's a little bit more familiar when they're encountering it? Because you think about cognitive load of kind of balancing new modalities with new information, and we want our students to be able to really focus on the information itself. So as much as we can provide, for example, if they need a quick tutorial of how to find the information, if I was using an AEA online resource, for example, like helping them know the login information and where to click and those kinds of things. But also thinking about, once again, the supports and scaffolds. So circling back to my previous idea of thinking about using the text-based option. Okay, if I needed my students, I was working on a reading comprehension piece, for example, providing some scaffolds and supports, like, could students use that choice board with a screen reader, or that option with a screen reader, just as an example. So thinking about how we can build in a little bit of those supports and scaffolds within the choice board, so that students can find success with what they're choosing. Ultimately, the intent of a choice board is to empower students to be expert learners and own that learning process in a way that's really honoring who they are and what they need and what their preferences might be. And so when you design your choice boards with the UDL lens, you're really designing with empathy and making sure that you're removing the barriers that might surface for your students, or that might hinder their ability to make choices for themselves, in order for them to be as successful in the learning process as possible.